Okay, so we're back and let's talk about what's going on with mom. So during that first trimester, which if you recall is from conception to the end of the 12th week, it's fairly common for moms to experience morning sickness. Um, there has been a lot of debate about what causes morning sickness, um, and why it's called morning sickness is a little bit of a mystery because a lot of women who have this experience nausea at any time of the day. It's not just in the morning. And they don't necessarily throw up as part of the sickness. It might just be nausea. Um, but the theories about morning sickness are currently surrounding sort of evolutionary interpretations and then hormonal fluctuations and things like that. So one theory is that when mom gets this spike of progesterone that helps to maintain the pregnancy, it makes her stomach sort of soften and not be able to hold food down as well. That it doesn't get digested as well overnight. So the last thing you ate last night might actually be triggering some illness in the morning because it's still there. Um, Evolutionarily, we've been seeing new theories that say that a lot of times moms become sick when they are exposed to, or they smell, or they think about foods that have historically been dangerous to us, things that have high probabilities of having parasites like meat, or things that have a high probability of having molds or things that, when they spoil. And so it's a way to keep women from eating things that might actually be harmful to the developing baby. So it's possibly a protective mechanism. Um, it's not really clear. Things I can tell you that are probably myths are the idea that if the embryo is a girl, mom is more likely to have morning sickness, and that's a myth. There's no link between the sex of the baby and then whether the mom has morning sickness or not. That's an old wives' tale. Um, it's a wives' tale that it happens only in the morning. It's probably not a function of having been laying down or something like that, because moms can get nauseated by the smell of something, maybe even throw up any time of the day. And sometimes women do it to such an extent that they actually need medical intervention because they're becoming dehydrated and stuff. So it's possibly going to stick all day. One thing that most women experience, not all, but almost everyone, this is good news for women who might get pregnant in the future, is that for most women, it is self-limiting. For most women, it usually goes away by the 12th week. But not always. Some women get to experience the glories of morning sickness their entire pregnancy for one reason or another, and it's not really clear why. One thing that we can tell you is that there are medications on the market today. There are what are called antiemetics. They are medicines that help us not to throw up, but they are no longer associated with birth defects like they were in the 1960s. In the 1960s, this miracle drug came on the market, they thought, called thalidomide, that was supposed to help women through the morning sickness. And it turned out that it was really harmful to the developing baby. And so women who took this medication in the very early stages of pregnancy were more likely to have babies who had their arms or their legs missing. So, and sometimes all of them, sometimes all four limbs would be missing. So it was pulled from the market very quickly. And when they figured it out, now it is back available in certain circumstances for people who have chemotherapy or AIDS-related nausea, because one of the biggest things that's wrong with that kind of nausea is that, or being treated for things like that, is that you can't keep any food down, and so you start to lose weight really fast. And so if we can get people to be able to eat, then a lot of times they can survive the treatment better. But you definitely don't take thalidomide if there's a possibility you might be pregnant. Miscarriage. Now, this is one of the hardest things for a woman, a couple to go through, is to know that you're pregnant. And even if you didn't want the baby, a lot of times people think, that if you found out that you miscarried when you were not really ready to have a baby anyway, that you'd be relieved. But a lot of times it's very difficult for couples, even even though they didn't really think they were ready. The idea that they miscarried can be fraught with all sorts of guilt and remorse and all sorts of things. Let alone couples who really really desperately wanted the baby, they have that all that stuff too. So, what causes miscarriage? Well, most commonly biological factors. The number one cause of the loss of a baby is chromosomal abnormalities. A lot of times, these kinds of abnormalities will cause miscarriage in the first 3 months, but sometimes they don't manifest themselves or don't have their effect until later on in the pregnancy. So, miscarriage is most common in the first 12 weeks of pregnancy, but it can happen anytime up to delivery. If it's within the normal gestation time to give birth and then the baby doesn't survive, it's called a stillbirth. So we're talking about anything up to prior to the due date. Hormonal problems. If mom has a inability to maintain high levels of progesterone, it can trigger a miscarriage. And a lot of times when that's discovered, future pregnancies are able to be preserved through the addition of progesterone. Certain kinds of infections can trigger miscarriages, and if mom is sick with other kinds of health problems, sometimes that can trigger a miscarriage. Age is one of the number one factors. If you're less than 35 years old, you only have a 15% chance of a miscarriage. Between 35 and 45, you have a 20 to 35% chance of miscarriage. If you're over 45 years old and you become pregnant, which is very difficult if you're over 45 anyway, if you do become pregnant, you have a 50% chance of miscarriage. So the older the mom is, the less likely she'll be able to carry a pregnancy to term. And then lifestyle factors. I've got this. I think this has to be a model in this picture, right? Smoking and drinking while pregnant. But in the old days, it was fairly common, not because people didn't know. I mean, they didn't find out until the early 1970s that alcohol was bad for babies, for developing fetuses. Certain kinds of drugs can trigger miscarriage. If mom doesn't eat enough to support herself and a baby, sometimes that can trigger miscarriage. Sometimes not, though. The baby oftentimes will suck what the baby needs out of mom, and mom will become, she'll develop osteoporosis and all sorts of things as a function of not eating enough while she's pregnant. Too much caffeine, something in excess of 500 milligrams a day. A typical venti Starbucks has about 250 milligrams. So we're talking about excessive caffeine. And then exposure to a variety of different teratogens. I'll just mention that smoking, most drugs, caffeine, alcohol, those things are teratogens, but there are other things in the environment that are teratogens. So what is a teratogen? Well, that's anything that you can be exposed to or consume that would be harmful to the developing embryo or fetus. So, in the first 2 weeks of life, it's really unlikely that an environmental teratogen is going to have an effect on a developing baby because the baby hasn't implanted yet. It isn't until after day 14 that the embryo is going to start collecting nutrition, oxygen, and then potentially other chemicals from mom's blood. So that's where it suddenly becomes important. Now, the embryonic stage is the most important. The first, from day 15 through week 8 that's when most physical effects of teratogens will occur. So here we have things that are going on in the fetus or in the embryo during this stage. We've got neural tube development where the spinal cord and the brain are being formed. So if you're exposed to certain kinds of teratogens, you can end up with neural tube defects, which is oftentimes referred to as spina bifida. If mom doesn't consume enough of certain kinds of nutrients is one way that spina bifida can happen, but other kinds of exposures can cause neural tube defects. Our heart's developing during the period between the middle of the 3rd week through week 8. Upper limbs develop from week 5 to week 8. Lower limbs, just a couple days later, they start to develop. Your palate and your lip are developing in weeks 5 through 8. Your ears are migrating and wiring up during the period between mid week 4 through the end of week 8. Your eyes are developing during that same basic time. You're making the enamel on your teeth. If you can believe it, you're already starting to develop teeth. And babies are born without any teeth. And then your first ones don't come in for a while. And then you don't even get your secondary set until you start losing them the primaries when you're like 8. And yet the enamel can be affected by stuff that happened during the 6th to the 8th week of pregnancy. There's the palate down there. And then, of course, the development of the sex organs, which we talked about in a previous chapter, happen in weeks 7, 8, and into week 9. So here we are in the fetal period. You'll notice there are fewer big biological, physical body parts that are developing during this stage. But you have ears, eyes, teeth, palate, and external genitalia that biologically you might be able to see the effect of exposure to teratogens. But what's going on across the entire pregnancy, of course, is the development of the brain. And so we oftentimes, if we have exposures that happen from week 9 on to something like, let's say, alcohol, the effect might be more on behavior or on cognition than it will be on an actual body part. So what we normally focus on in the embryonic stage is the possibility that the body will be affected by having been exposed to something. In the fetal period, we're usually worried about the developing brain and cognitive abilities and things like that. Okay, so what kinds of things are we talking about? For the most part, the placenta filters out most things that would be harmful to the baby. So the job of the placenta, it embeds in the uterine lining, and it brings the baby's blood supply into basic contact with mom's blood supply. Now, they don't intermingle. You can't share blood cells and stuff like that. That would not be healthy. But so that's not how that works. What it is this membrane separates mom's blood supply from baby's blood supply, and mom's blood delivers food, nutrition, oxygen to the fetus through the placenta, and then the fetus delivers to mom waste products so mom can eliminate them. Occasionally, most of the time, that little membrane filters pretty much everything out. Most naturally occurring things, like most bacteria or fungus or viruses, most of the time that can be filtered out by that membrane. But there are things in our modern world that can permeate that membrane. So things like cocaine or alcohol or radiation. These things can actually permeate the membrane and expose the baby to things that are in mom's blood. Now, I didn't mention cigarettes because cigarettes, the big effect they seem to have is by constricting the blood vessels in mom's body and actually they constrict down there where they're making contact with the placenta, just like they're constricting everywhere in her body, because that's what nicotine does. And so it deprives the baby of nutrition and oxygen. So the big teratogenic effect of cigarettes is that it can stunt the baby's growth. It can actually cause detachment of the baby from the uterus, and you can end up in a miscarriage if it's deprived of enough oxygen. But the biggest effect is usually it makes the baby smaller than average. Alcohol can pass across the membrane and can interfere with the migration of the facial structures, and later on in pregnancy can affect the migration of brain structures, and then you can end up with, like I said, behavioral and cognitive problems. So like I said, I didn't want to spend too much time on what's going on with babies. I just wanted to make sure that the things that I want to focus my time on mom, and teratogens a lot of times are things that moms can avoid, like by not smoking, not drinking alcohol, not using recreational drugs, avoiding radiation exposure, which includes things like not getting x-rays unless you absolutely need them, not taking transatlantic flights while pregnant because you go way up in the atmosphere and you get so much radiation when you're up there in those higher altitudes. So there are steps that moms can take. Unfortunately, there are some things that we can't avoid. Sometimes we get exposed to things we can't help it, and so that's called random life, right? Unfortunately, life is like that, but we can take the best steps that we can. So for example, one one thing that we've just in the past probably 20 years started to recognize is that the flu virus, if mom's exposed to the flu virus around 16 to 24 weeks of gestation, it may affect the developing fetus's brain, especially the hippocampus, and interfere with the orderly development of that structure. And what that might do, the evidence is suggesting that it might lead to schizophrenia later on in life, like 20 years down the road. The person might start to develop, the baby might start to develop symptoms of schizophrenia, and it may be tied back to this having had the flu virus during this stage. So things that moms are advised to do today is to take a flu vaccine before they become pregnant or before the flu season starts while they're pregnant, and that'll help to protect the fetus from exposure. So there are things that we can do. And then there's certain randomness, and sometimes we're exposed to teratogens. So anyway, so that's that on teratogens. Let's go ahead and take a little break, and we'll come back and we'll talk about embryonic and fetal testing and move on from there.